Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Brookings. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with our Foreign Policy Program and specifically our Africa Security Initiative, and we're very grateful that all of you, and especially Terence and Abi, are helping us today continue to give this new initiative some momentum, and with a focus on one of Africa's most important countries, although often sort of a quiet country in a way, Ethiopia. And when I say quiet, what I mean is that in these days we hear a lot about Boko Haram in Nigeria, we hear a lot about ISIS throughout the continent. We all have followed various big civil wars in recent years in the Horn of Africa, well, especially in the Great Lakes region of Africa. Of course, Ethiopia had its civil wars, it's had its famine, but in modern times it's sometimes been a little quieter place, even though, of course, it has the home of the Africa Union and is one of the most important countries in Africa by virtually any measure. It is the second most populous country in Africa after Nigeria. It is the oldest independent country in Africa, and in fact, one of the oldest in the world. It was never colonized, although it was occupied briefly by Mussolini's Italy several decades ago. It's a largely Christian country, but with its own traditions and its own Orthodox church history that goes back, of course, to many centuries, several centuries ago, 2 centuries ago specifically. And yet it has also very important Muslim population, some very interesting ethnic dynamics, and a history that involved a lot of Cold War dynamics, and then a very turbulent period in the 70s and 80s, a difficult war with Eritrea in the 1990s, and now still ongoing problems in its neighborhood from Somalia and spillover effects from that country, as well as, of course, being in a tough neighborhood in general, near Sudan, near Egypt. I know there are some people in the room who know this history a lot better than I do, and we're going to get into that very soon, and I'm sure the history will inform a lot of our current discussions. But as you know today, and before I introduce Terence and Abi a little bit more, our primary focus is thinking about security in Africa in this project, and then specifically as regards Ethiopia, we want to talk about its current internal security challenges, and that's certainly one topic. A second topic is the broader regional security dynamics in which, of course, Ethiopia is heavily intertwined by its participation in the Africa Union mission in Somalia, by its role as being the headquarters for the African Union, and just more generally by being in such an important part of the continent and representing such a substantial fraction of Africa's population, GDP, and so forth. And then finally, we want to talk about Ethiopia's internal social, economic, and political cohesion, seeing these, of course, as important in their own right, but also quite relevant to Ethiopia's long-term stability and security. And so that's the basic context. I think just a couple more words about who we're joined by today. Terence Lyons is an associate professor at George Mason University. We were privileged to have him here at Brookings. He and I were here together in the 1990s. He worked with Francis Deng, a very important Sudanese diplomat and UN official, and others on the concept of sovereignty as responsibility, in many ways sort of the lead up to the responsibility to protect movement that really reached a lot of its culmination around the turn of the millennium. So a lot of important early work on that. Wrote an important book here at Brookings on Liberia. In his time at George Mason, he's worked on Ethiopia a fair amount. He was an election observer with the Carter Center there about a decade ago, and we're very privileged to have him and his expertise, and he'll be the lead-off speaker in just a moment. Abi Asefa is an associate professor at St. Lawrence University and a long-standing student of many issues in Africa, including Ethiopia. And I think he'll probably be helpful across all 3 of these issues that I mentioned: immediate security challenges within Ethiopia itself, regional security, but maybe especially that third category of social, economic, and political cohesion. He studied a lot about African anthropology, sociology, and politics, and so we'll be delighted to have his contributions as well. The way we're going to proceed is that I will give the floor here in just a moment to Terence for some opening remarks, and then to Abi. We'll speak a bit up here amongst ourselves, and then we'll go to you, and we'll look forward to your questions at about the halfway point until the finish. So without further ado, Terence, thanks for being here, and over to you, my friend.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. It is great to be back at Brookings. I remember being in this room, but sitting on that side many, many times back in, it couldn't have been the 90s, we're not that old. It must have been when we were in high school or something like that. Otherwise it's not possible. Thank you all for coming. I know that many of you will be anxious to ask questions, but I'll just say a few things to kind of get us started, some on the larger security questions and then some on internal dynamics as I see them in Ethiopia. The first thing to say about the security in the Horn of Africa is to recognize that Ethiopia is the irreplaceable center of gravity of the region. It's 100 million people with borders on all the other states of the region. It has the region's largest, most effective military. It is inevitably going to be the pole of either stability or instability in its position in this kind of web of relationships in the Horn of Africa. And the Horn of Africa is a very difficult neighborhood at the moment and has been for far too long. But that Ethiopia's policies relating to peace, stability, are fundamental to the larger region. I'll just go through them quickly, and then there'll be opportunities to follow up. In Somalia, Ethiopian troops are deeply involved in the peace operation there, and Ethiopia has a long, long history of involvement in Somali politics. Its neighbor to the north, Eritrea, after fighting a horrific civil war from 1998 to 2000, still remains a frozen conflict with Ethiopia not implementing the Ethiopian-Eritrean Border Demarcation Commission's decision on the border. And South Sudan not only is, well, in both South Sudan, Abyei, and Sudan, Khartoum, Ethiopia is a key player both in the peacekeeping operations. It's Ethiopian forces in Abyei. Ethiopia has forces in the other peace missions as well, and also as a convener of peace talks. The South Sudan talks in particular right now, very difficult South Sudan talks at this very moment. Where am I? Thirdly, Ethiopia is the host of significant refugee populations from each of its, well, most of its neighboring states, certainly from Somalia, Eritrea, and South Sudan. From Washington's point of view, from the US government's point of view, therefore, partly as a result of those things that I've just delineated, Ethiopia's relative stability is seen as a contribution to stability in the region and in Africa, and therefore something the United States supports. In addition, there is a counterterrorism piece to U.S. interest in Ethiopia. Ethiopia has supported, well, how do I want maybe put that more precisely? The United States and Ethiopia share some common perceptions as to where threats are coming from in the region, but also have two autonomous policies towards counterterrorism, particularly as it has to do with Somalia. I can elaborate that in a minute. Domestically, however, Ethiopia is a tougher story, both in terms of its own internal developments, its internal sources of stability, and how the United States relates to Ethiopia. It is a very powerful authoritarian state with a very powerful single party that won 100% of the seats in the last election. But I think it's facing unprecedented, and not unprecedented, but a particular time of very difficult, complex domestic challenges. And let me run through what I mean by them. The first, to go back a little bit farther, but only a couple of years, were the Ethiopian Muslim demonstrations. Well, Ethiopia is probably about as many Muslims as there are Christians, or at least as many Muslims as there are Orthodox Christians. Very significant Muslim population that has long and historically felt alienated, not second-class citizens in their own home. After a series of demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, the leadership was arrested, was convicted of terrorism in August 2015. Slightly more recently in the Oromo region, again, population that perceives, for good reason, itself as being historically marginalized, there was a particular spark or a flare-up around a plan to expand Addis Ababa, the capital, into areas that are controlled by the Oromo region. But even probably more characteristic is that there were sort of spontaneous demonstrations that then very, very quickly spread across Oromia without a lot of central coordination, demonstrating that there's a really deep source of grievance in the Oromo region. There was a lot of violence, a lot were killed. Not the leader of the demonstrations, but an important Oromo opposition political leader, Bekele Gerba, was arrested and is also, I believe, facing terrorism charges. I won't go into just maybe to get it all on the record, as there were. There's a long-term counterinsurgency in the Ogaden region, the Somali-inhabited part of Ethiopia, and there's an opposition movement called Gimbut 7, which has folks in Asmara. That is another source of domestic or regional opposition. The most recent event is instability in Gambela, some really quite horrific violence in the last really just week or 10 days. An enormously complicated story that has to do with the balance between local ethnic groups, the Anuak and Nur, complicated further by some significant numbers of people brought, highlanders as they're called, people from the central highland areas of Ethiopia who are resettled in this area along the Sudanese border, further complicated by something like 250,000 refugees from the Sudan, land leases, and so on. And most recently, a group from South Sudan identified as from the Murle ethnic group killed some 200 and kidnapped some over 100 children and have fled back into South Sudan. Very difficult to know what's going on. In and of itself, disturbances in Gambela are, how to put this, is that this is a peripheral region, not in the center of Ethiopia. In my view, the more important issues for the stability of Ethiopia itself, not for the tragic deaths in the Gambela region, are the Ethiopian Muslim and the Ethiopian Oromo stories, which are two very, very large populations across the center of the country. There's lots to be said on the economic piece and on the drought, but why don't I leave it there and turn it over to my friend Abi.
Excellent, thank you. Abi, over to you, Professor.
Okay, my name is Abi Asafa. As you can see, I have an accent, so I'm originally from Ethiopia. So I've been living in the United States for the last 30 years. And okay, Ethiopia is my homeland, and but I try to be as impartial as I can be, but which is very difficult. In any case, so what are we talking about? Are we talking about Ethiopia? Are we talking about security, or are we talking about the state, or are we talking about the global change? So a lot of issues are at stake here. So to me, I think when we talk about issues of security, whether we like it or not, we always tie it with the states. So basically, it becomes an issue to either legitimate the state or support the state if we happen to like the state, or a point of delegitimate the state if we happen not to like the state. But the main issue is security is thrown by the wayside. To me, my point is to bring why security has become such an important issue now more than before. Not only in Ethiopia, it's throughout the world. Even great countries like the United States, I mean, we know every day that how our civil liberties has been infringed by draconian, or like, the Patriot Act and so on and so forth. But somehow, when it comes to the US, at least we have the ability to segregate the state versus the criminal justice system. For example, if you hear in the news, the Chicago Police Department has been chronically racist, attacking and undermining the African American communities, all of us inadvertently, consciously would say, okay, that is a problem only contained in Chicago. It has nothing to do with the federal government. That's fair. But when it comes to the third world country, whatever happens at one level, at a local level or against a specific group, we have the tendency of tying it with the state. So the state somehow is becoming the embodiment of the security apparatus. Here it's not. Why is that? To me, that is a very important issue, because looking at the audience, even though there are some Ethiopian Americans or Ethiopians like me in the audience, most of you are Americans or non-Ethiopians. So therefore, I am a world system school of thoughts. That's where I was thrown. So I look at the systemic transformation of the world economy, of the entire world system. So what am I trying to say? The first thing that I want to bring to your attention is no state is perfect, regardless, including the Ethiopian state. But if we want to resolve the security situation or to understand the security matters in Ethiopia and the Horn region in general, we have to understand, okay, why is the state in Ethiopia succeeded, or why Ethiopia is secure? Well, we might say because the state is so draconian and totalitarian or authoritarian, it doesn't allow any movement, so it suppresses the people. But I can tell you, more draconian authoritarian states that are not capable of mitigating or undermining or stopping terror threat, for instance. So what is it? To me, the most important thing is the ethnic federal policies that the Ethiopian government has implemented. To me, it's a very important factor that has been responsible, more so than the government's ability in making the country more or less relatively peaceful, especially in a region or in a neighborhood that is a tinderbox. You know, the Horn of Africa is very... So what is up? Why is ethnic federalism? Well, ethnic federalism to me is not something that is an invention of Ethiopia. It is to me a question that is more of the 21st. It's a post-liberal order or a post-liberal framework of what a nation is, because we have the tendency of equating nation and state where they are not. Actually, it's not the state invented the nation, to me. We tried in Ethiopia, the emperor time, the military government time. We wanted to have one government, one nationality, so on and so forth. And we know what happened. We had revolutions, we have civil wars, we have what have you. But now we have this ethnic issue. So every ethnicity, which are in Ethiopia determined by their linguistic variables, they are allowed at least to govern themselves. So some of us would say the Ethiopian government is completely dividing and undermining the country, those who want one Ethiopia. And there are the other side who say, no, the ethnic policy is actually not gone enough. Actually, the government is giving lip service to this fundamental question of rights, but still is an Abyssinian Orthodox Christian dictated state. So it's up to you which one. But to me, that is beside the point. The point, the most important is when it comes to security, we in Ethiopia, or the people in Ethiopia, it's very important to me to go to Ethiopia and feel safe. I mean, it's very safe. You can go to Addis or any other country or any other part I take students to Ethiopia, American kids, every summer from my school. Why? Is it because I have some special magic to make them safe? No, because I know wherever I take them, they are safe. And they come back safely, okay? So what we, is this?
It's good, keep going.
But you have to tell me.
You got 5 minutes or so.
So the most important thing is, actually for all of us, is to see not the state primarily, because the state, we can't do it anyway because it's an important actor, it's out there, but it's also a very easy actor to point finger at. But pointing finger at the state does not necessarily address the question at hand. The question of security. Okay. Security is important. People live peacefully, they go to their homes and come, because something that we take for granted here. It also, the people in Ethiopia or throughout the world, they deserve it because we see a lot of places. Look at Syria, for instance, the refugee crisis, people being bombed, whatever. We don't have that. So to me, what I am imploring to the audience is to look at an alternative way of a unit of analysis. Let's not make the state our unit of analysis. Instead, let's look at the world system as our unit of analysis. If we do that, then the state, instead of becoming an independent island that can be criticized or whatever by its own term, we should look at the interstate system itself. Because right now we are using terms haphazardly like failed state. God knows what it means. Or civil society. I don't know what it is. Or human rights. Well, it sounds good, but if you scratch it, it's loaded. But we just throw it, and all those terms are used to delegitimize whatever state. Do we have a civil society in the US? I don't know. If you tell me yes, yeah. But do you have a civil society in Ethiopia? It's an open-ended term. But who are the most prominent spokespeople for civil society? Well, it's Western NGOs. So are they really representing the Ethiopian society against the states? I don't know. So coming back to I don't think so. Coming back to the US policy, I think the US government have a very good relationship with Ethiopia, not because for Ethiopians' interest only, for its own interest, because it's a global power. It's involved deeply in the fight against terror, whatever, and Ethiopia is a very good player. But at the same time, you have US policymakers who are condemning the so-called human rights or abuse of civil society. Which America are we talking about? Is there one voice or two voices? Well, there are two voices, but America can afford to have the two voices. But those two voices should also be given to Ethiopia. So let the Ethiopian civil societies come on their own term, which brings me to the third point. Is there a problem in Ethiopia? Yes, there is a problem in Ethiopia. And the problem has to do with the issue of land. So far, it has been okay. It starts bringing some confusion or some problems recently, but the identity of land has to be settled for one way or the other. Is it a commodity or is it not? Well, the government say it's not a commodity, it belongs to the people, meaning the state owns it. Well, but just because the state owns it doesn't mean the people have the right to land. But at the same time, the land is leased to investors, so it's a commodity. That is a recipe for disaster in the making because it undermines the very security that the Ethiopia as a country and the region as a whole is founded on, because it's there to protect the people against the infringement of big players in dispossessing their lands, but at the same time, the land is for development purposes or whatever. For capital accumulation purposes, it's been sold. That problem, to me, is the fundamental problem, if there is, in Ethiopia, that would undermine the greater security of the country in the future. So this is what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to each of these gentlemen, and then we'll go to you. Abby, I want to start with you, just picking up on a point that you were raising, and you were giving us a lot of a very helpful understanding of the nation of the Ethiopian state. But I wanted to ask you about, this sort of implied in some of what you said, but I want to make it more explicit. How strong is the sense of Ethiopian identity for most Ethiopians? To what extent is being Ethiopian important versus being of a given ethnic group, religion, part of the country? And of course, and I ask this with genuine curiosity as a person who doesn't know Ethiopia very well myself, but as I look at Ethiopia, I'm struck by its remarkable assets and traditions, right? The kind of long history, the kind of proud independence, the central role in the African Union, what Terence said before about its role as a regional powerhouse. There's a lot to be proud of if you're an Ethiopian.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot.
Runners.
Yep, right, exactly, and marathon runners. But there's also a lot that could potentially divide people. And of course, we saw Eritrea secede just a couple of decades ago. And so, as an Ethiopian, how would you describe the nature of Ethiopian identity as an individual?
Well, I don't see the Ethiopian identity substantively different from any other part of the world. For example, if you ask any American, what are you? It depends of who's asking and in what context. If you ask an American, if a British guy asks him, where are you from? You'd say, I am an American. But the same person might have another identity if he's an African American. If another American asks him, he say, I'm an African American. Whatever. So to me, in Ethiopia, yes, there is a very strong sense of Ethiopian identity, which is historically founded on the so-called civilization. It's a Christian-based, Orthodox Christian, and is very much tied with the Ethiopian archaic state, the traditional state, and the identity of traditional Ethiopia. To be an Ethiopian, you have to be Christian, or not to be part of the community that we think of Ethiopia now. You have to have land, you have to be Christian. If you are not Christian, you have no right to land. That's why you have most of the merchants in Ethiopia are Muslims. Most of the people who do, what do you call it, metal, blacksmith, and so on and so forth, they are not Christians. Actually, they are considered, the division of labor is so rigid, they are even looked at as someone with evil eye. That's not only in Ethiopia, it's all over the world. Look at the Jewish history in Europe. They are not entitled to land, so most of them were merchants. So we blame them for being money grabbing, whatever. The same thing happens in Ethiopia towards Muslims. But the Ethiopian identity right now, as we speak, is changing. That is the most important thing. It's not one day you become like the traditional way of looking at Ethiopia, or it's a Solomonic dynasty, 3,000 years of history. That is like a very good fairy tale, you know. But the majority of Ethiopia have nothing to do with Solomonic Empire, or that's only the Abyssinian part. But how about those? So those people should go? No. What is happening right now? People who were supposed to be naturally non-Ethiopians, they are in Ethiopia. For example, look at the Ogaden. I know a guy who who joined the emperor's air force. He's from Somalia, so he trained everything. So finally, he's supposed to fly solo. And they were saying, no, you can't. Why? Because he's Somali, even though he's Ethiopian. So right now, we have a new identity that is in the making. For example, the Ethiopians, actually, if you go to the Somali part of Ethiopia, it's peaceful. You might say, well, yeah, there is a lot of warfare, the government is, but who does most of the security job? The Somalis themselves. So the Ethiopian government has succeeded, or the Ethiopian state has succeeded because of the ethnic federalism policy in accommodating Somalis to take care of their own. We might agree, well, they are pro the government. Yes, they are. So what? We are pro-US too. You understand what I'm saying? So that's how we should look at it.
Thank you. Terence, let me ask you a question. You alluded a minute ago to the drought challenges that Ethiopia is again facing, and some people are worried this is going to get worse with global climate change. And of course, we know just how terrible the drought problem was 30 years ago and at various other times. That's one sort of big internal factor that needs to be, brought into an equation of assessing Ethiopia's prognosis, if you will. And that's sort of what I'm going to ask you about before we get back to politics and security in a little bit. But so one big fact is it's a country that is prone to drought and may become more so. A second fundamental fact, more positively, is it's been having 10% per year GDP growth rates in recent times, which would seem very promising. A third fact, which you also mentioned, is it's got sometime right around now, it's reaching the 100 million population threshold, which will be only the second country in Africa to reach that, with a very high growth rate, I think the 10th or 12th highest in the world, which can't be all good for a relatively small country with already 100 million people. But yet, it's at the same time that there's a 10% GDP growth rate, so maybe it's not all bad either. There seems to be a certain amount of dynamism in the population and the demographics. So when you studied a lot of countries in Africa, when you look structurally at Ethiopia's sort of underlying assets and trends, do you tend to see more basis for hopefulness and optimism, recognizing we can't all predict the future and many things will intercede that get in the way of any prediction we could make today? Or do you see more basis for concern and growing stress, demands on land that's already, as Abi said, not always a source of unity, already in relatively short supply, already shared by a very large population base?
That'll be a short answer. No, it's a very complicated answer to a very complicated question. Let me take a couple of pieces of it and then see if I can come up with some even tentative or very guarded overarching conclusion. The first is to say that there is a very serious drought in Ethiopia right now. I think the last I saw was some 12 million people are in need of food assistance, 10 million at least. That's a huge number, but again, it's 100 million Ethiopians, and so numbers are always big in Ethiopia, was the point that I want to make there. The government has moved efficiently to respond to this drought. The international community has been working with the government to provide relief in the context of this drought, and so I don't think there's any evidence that the drought is becoming a famine, and that's a very important distinction. Where in the mid-1980s there was famine because of a lack of a response to a drought. That's not the case this time. The international community has not provided the level of resources that the UN and the humanitarian groups feel are necessary, but that's a different question that has to do with Washington and the EU and the global systems, to go back to Abi's point. The economy has grown remarkably, and on the surface that's obvious to anybody who goes back to Ethiopia after having been gone for a while, not only in skyscrapers and modern shopping malls on Bole Road and so forth, but also in the more rural areas, the number of roads that have been built, the number of regional universities that have been built, often not staffed with a lot of professors, but a lot of construction of universities and a lot of construction of really kind of micro-rural health clinics that actually often are staffed with, trained to a certain degree staff that's able to do inoculations and deal with maternal health and so on. But with a population growing, the 10% growth rate has given it a period of, has been very important for a period of stability. The question would be is that do the laws of gravity eventually apply to Ethiopia's economy, and 10% growth doesn't last forever? then then as you were putting it on stresses, then I think there'll be really increased stresses on the system as there are fewer resources to distribute, fewer jobs, fewer, the universities, no jobs for university graduates, and things like that. Now, to date, since taking power in the early 1990s, the EPRDF, as a powerful political party, has been able to manage a series of stresses, from war with Eritrea, which you also mentioned, to a series of contested elections and regional insurgencies and so on. It will be, I think, further tested in the future as this clash or this tension, as you pointed out, between a growing population, increased land scarcity, constrained resources come up against limits. And so in that way, I wouldn't conclude that I'm either optimistic or pessimistic about the future, but it's going to take a very careful management. And then for the reasons that I said in my first remarks, there were some indications that the current government is not handling domestic dissent in a very effective way.
Excellent. So, Abby, that leads me naturally to my next question about politics, the EPRDF. But let's also bring ourselves back to last summer when President Obama visited Addis Ababa, and he got into some interesting trouble because he celebrated Ethiopia as a democracy. And on the one hand, you could say it is. We have a prime minister who's been in office now almost 4 years, Haile Mariam, and there are elections, and certainly most people would say what's going on now with Ethiopian politics is better than the 1970s through early 90s at least, regardless of what else you might think about the current system. On the other hand, this is starting to look like a one-party state. And so I guess it's a two-part question. How do you feel about Ethiopia's politics? And here we'll begin to jumpstart the discussion with the audience, I'm sure, as well. I'm sure a number of you have various opinions. But also, what role should the outside world play in trying to encourage a positive evolution of those politics, if you want to also hazard a thought there?
Okay. I was before the talk, I was talking to Terence. I was in Kenya like 2 weeks ago. Kenya has a different political culture. I mean, the newspapers openly criticize the government, the head of states, and so on and so forth. Can that happen in Ethiopia? Well, even if the government, me personally, I'm not part of this of the present government. I didn't get anything. I don't have a vested interest per se to support. But one thing I know, when I was in Ethiopia during the 2005 contested election, the free press was not really there to, it was not engaged in constructive criticism of the government. It was an open warfare. It's just like either leave or not. We don't have that. I mean, let's be honest. Let alone in Ethiopia, even in the US, even within the Ethiopian diaspora, there is no civil dialogue. It is winner take all, either my way or the highway. Everybody knows that. So that is not only restricted to the government. This is to the mentality of the Ethiopian political culture. Having said that, is Ethiopia a one-party state? Yes. Is that good? No, but I don't think it is such a big deal, because a lot of countries, even the so-called democratic countries, we know, like in the US, every day when you open the radio, you'd see big money is doing this and that. A lot of the people look at Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's attraction. To me, there is a systemic crisis at the global level. When it comes to countries like Ethiopia, personally, I would rather have a strong-handed government that provided peace than a so-called democratic government who is likely to be summoned to the International Criminal Court. Why should the president of Kenya should be summoned, or of Sudan? So there is a double standard in the global order. You understand? So who is the judge? To me, the most important thing in Ethiopia is how do we involve the Ethiopian people in the present political, economic progress. To me, I have a problem. Yes, the Ethiopian economy is growing, but it is growing because a lot of manufacturing jobs are coming to Ethiopia because the wages in China and what have you is going up. So Ethiopia is the next stage where you'll have cheap labor. So they relocate, and sooner or later down the road, you're gonna have labor movements demanding for higher wages, and they move wherever they can go. This is how the global system has been operating. But in the meantime, what the Ethiopian government should do is to let the Ethiopian people be hustle. I mean, to put it in a different way, let them hustle. When I went to Kenya, I see Ethiopians who move to Kenya, have access to cars, and they do like legally or illegally, they hustle how to they make money off them. They cannot do that in Ethiopia. Why? Because in Ethiopia we have a 200% taxation on automobile. I don't know why. People change their attitude as soon as they go behind the wheel. In Ethiopia, they become just like a powerful lion or lioness. It's because the car, it's a very important thing. Why is that? Why we don't allow with the infrastructure, whatever that has been built, the urbanization, the different cities that are being constructed. You have beautiful roads, but the cars are really bad. In Kenya, it's the opposite. The roads are bad, the cars are good. So if they allow cars and so little stuff, you know, what has been imposed with the previous communist government has to be really replaced. The people has to be able to hustle because the government cannot provide jobs by dictating terms. It cannot. It's going to become like any other command economy, which is not going to work. We should balance the government strategy and plan by allowing people to hustle. That is what's missing in Ethiopia. And that can be done. It's a matter of will, I guess.
Thank you. Terence, you want to comment on this question of political evolution in Ethiopia?
I want to start by going back to the visit by the president, because while he, in his press conference with Haile Mariam, did talk about democratically elected, he also said, and I actually brought it with me, in his Africa Union speech, as I discussed with Prime Minister Haile Mariam, elections are just the start of democracy. I believe Ethiopia will not fully unleash the potential of its people if journalists are restricted or legitimate opposition groups can't participate in the campaign process. And I think I would follow that line of logic, that for Ethiopia to have a more vibrant, less brittle political system, there has to be a way for dissent to be expressed, for people to mobilize, for people to hold political meetings, and that has not been the case in Ethiopia since 2005. And I think that is a worry, that it leads to a political system. The party is both very, very strong, but also very brittle, and that will it be able to is it pliant enough to be able to adjust to a changing country, a country that's becoming more urbanized, for example, although the political system is really based on this ethno-federal idea of ethnically defined states. The population has grown in the cities. That's an issue. It's a system that's really designed having to do with small agriculture and land, when still a very agricultural country, Ethiopia, but again, increasingly urbanized, increasingly people entering informal or formal relationships in the low-wage jobs, and so there are challenges ahead, and it's not. That's the worry to me. Is like, will the system be able to accommodate those changes in a way that opens up the political system?
I think this is a good moment to go to all of you. I've got some questions still in the back of my mind about regional security, and I'm sure we'll come back to those later, whether you do or I bring those up. But let's involve you now. And I'm sure this discussion of Ethiopian internal politics is already going to have some folks wanting to weigh in. So I see, I'll take two at a time. And I think I'll start here in the fifth row with the two next to each other. Ladies first, right. And then so we'll take those two, and then we'll go to another round.
Lulit Mesfin, Gimot 7. movement for democracy. Professor Lyons, when you said the TPLF regime, I mean, if anybody knows about Ethiopia, it's you. And when you say it has managed the conflicts related to elections and so on and so forth, are you condoning what TPLF has been doing? Because it has managed to stay in power as you do because it is militarily powerful and it's not afraid to kill people. If you were there in 2005 as an election observer, you've noticed that 193 people were killed and nobody has been held accountable for it and is still doing it. And about 4 months ago, 440 or almost, for peacefully protesting against the land grab. It's not even, it's the so-called Addis Ababa master plan is a land grab by the TPLF regime to give that land to its cronies, were gunned down. And these people are being trained by the U.S. military. So are you condoning what TPLF is doing when you say it has managed? Sure, managed by killing people. Thank you.
And then you can give to the gentleman next to you. Please, go ahead, sir.
Hi, I'm Gordon Dale. My question really relates to the legal system and whether, obviously any form of government is strengthened by a belief in a legal system. And any comments you have on that, both the national and maybe the regional systems, would be interesting.
Terrence, you want to start, and then?
I will start. I mean, I position myself as a social scientist who's not Ethiopian, and therefore it's not for me to condone or condemn. It's for the Ethiopian people to make those judgments, in my view. My point on managing conflict is the point that I think you were making, is how that this system has managed to keep itself in power. It has done a remarkable job of that. And I never said it was democratic. That's not my point. I called it authoritarian, but as a strong authoritarian system, it has managed conflicts, often through arrests, often through the use of force. But that's how I am trying to explain how a system reproduces itself, stays in power, maintains itself in power. And that's the point that I was that I'm trying to make. Do you have something on the legal system, or either of those points?
Well, to me, the legal system also should be looked at in a context because, ideally, the law or the judiciary should be separated from the executive, so on. That's a very good idea. But that can only work if it works. It only works in very few countries of the world. The permanent exceptions or the ideal types. To me, in the countries like Ethiopia, to have an independent judiciary is asking too much. I mean, we can hope for it, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because the state is, within the interstate system, it's a very weak state. It's not a strong state. The US is a very strong state, for instance. And it has an independent judiciary. But in recent years, as you can read the news, to replace the late Justice Scalia, the president's appointee is not going to be accepted. So why? Because even the judiciary system is very much politicized. Why? To me, that is very important. It's important because the state system has been replaced by a different regime of security across the world. So to me, to pinpoint on countries like Ethiopia and say, look, you don't have an independent judiciary, I mean, it's meaningless to me as far as, because there isn't an independent judiciary more and more.
Okay, we got to go for a couple more. The gentleman in the third row. And then we'll go back to the gentleman in about the 10th row. So that'll be round two, the two of you.
Lawrence Freeman. I've just been studying economic development in Africa for 25 years, and I work with the Lake Chad Basin Commission. The question I have for both of you, both touched on the economic policy. Really, Ethiopia's policy now is begrudgingly being recognized by the West, economic policy as being successful. Although reading the IMF report, They don't understand why it's successful. But the government, the ruling party, did make a decision in 2001 to eradicate poverty. That was a political decision by Mellis. And Mellis's legacy is the state developmental intervention, not the free market, not free trade, but the state plays a role. And there's an alliance now between Ethiopia and China on that. And you can see, you've probably been to Addis more than I have, you see the tremendous development in railroads. And now the second growth transformation plan, the draft is at least released, and it's going to be a huge increase in energy production. So it seems to me that Ethiopia is actually providing a template or model for economic development, far more in the countries, Nigeria and other countries I've been studying, in terms of economic growth, the state doing this. And isn't that fundamentally changing the cities? I mean, the country. They've apparently, according to the reports, reduced poverty by 33%. People there are living bad, we've all seen it, but they have confidence that they're moving in a better direction. And they don't have major natural resources outside of 10 river systems. So I think the model is a good model. I don't think it's going to collapse. And I think that this is something I would ask you, why doesn't the United States support this? We have no economic support except aid to Ethiopia. Why are we not recognizing this potential development, which I consider the most positive in the Horn of Africa?
Now let's take one more, again, about 6 rows back. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. My name is Niman Zalaka from Ethiopian Satellite Television Radio. My starting point is with Professor Terence Lyon's risk assessment he wrote, I believe, 2011, analyzing the, yes?
Yes, something like that,
Yes.
a number of years ago.
Yeah, and then you said that the situation in Ethiopia is very fragile, and the semblance or, of stability is really brittle. The situation in Ethiopia in the long term may erupt, blow up, a lot of fissures and fault lines you predicted in the long term. What we are seeing right now is that Ethiopia is at the brink, despite the fact that some people, bury their head like the proverbial ostrich. What we are seeing in Ethiopia is conflict. In the north, we have conflict. In the south, we have conflict. The Oromo protest, raison d'etat of this regime has been that it brought equality of nation nationalities and that it has given rights to all the nation nationalities. But look, in 100 zones and areas of the south, the Oromo people protested, demanding justice and the rule of law and freedom. And this regime is a minority regime. Let's come and face the reality. It controls, dominates the economy, and the developmental state is a veneer, as a cover for hegemony and monopoly of state power, economic resources by a minority group, the TPLF, that represents only 6% of the population. And the Western countries, especially the US and Europeans, I think have to come to the realization that Ethiopia is at the brink of disaster. People are fed up. The Amara, the Oromo, the South, etc. I think it's a wake-up call, the Oromo protest especially. As you know, Professor Terence Lyons, the PTRF said, the reason d'etat for its legitimacy has been the equality of nation nationalities. But what we are seeing throughout Ethiopia is nation nationalities are rising up and said, we are fed up. We are fed up the monopoly of economy, political, military power by Tigrayans. This is the reality we have to wake up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Okay, Abi, you want to start first, and then
Yeah.
economic model, and then internal dissent?
Okay. For the economic model, I agree with the speaker, because the U.S. government does not support it, not because for substantive reason, it's because for purely ideological reason. Basically, the U.S., we subscribe to the free market model. Is there really a free market? If the market is so free, we wouldn't have no capitalism, because capitalism is based on monopolization. Why do you have patenting? Why do you have market cornering? And so actually, if you want to look at competition, the competition is not between Chiquita and Dole when it comes to banana. The competition is between all the banana producing countries to outbid each other to the race to the bottom. So when you see Chiquita and Dole, it's not a competition. It's a monopoly cornering the global banana market. So in Ethiopia, the state has to get involved in the economy. Otherwise, what would be the alternative? It's going to be like Eastern Congo. The civil war in Congo, a lot of countries are involved, Rwanda, Uganda, what have you. Why? Because there is a very precious commodity called coltan. Your computer, your iPhone, your cell phone, your iPod, they all have that ingredient. It's part of the global commodity chain of the leading sector, of the IT industry. So isn't it cheaper to have a civil war? I mean, when you look at it in a purely capitalistic perspective, if there is no state, would you rather have a state that taxes, that have infrastructures, rules of law, whatever, or would you have to have some militias who force people to work like slaves in the mines by raping and terrorizing people? Somehow, that thing goes to China and comes to Silicon Valley, and we are okay with it. It's cheaper. This is how, if we let the so-called free market on its own. I mean, let's face it. We need to have the states. In America, we have a very strong state who is directly involved in the economy. The financial sector is controlled or regulated, even though there are some crying. The Federal Reserve Bank is basically defining the value of money. It's not the financial market who authenticates the strengths and weaknesses of the dollar. That's one. The other is, even if we condemn the government for its policies of dividing people, what is our alternative? Me, I wanted to hear people who tell me, don't give me this, we need to have a rule of law. What does it mean? A rule of law like what? How are you going to put the Ethiopian people, not in abstraction, because there are, I don't know, 100 million of them. Each and every individual is supposed to be a free, willing, rational actor. Well, that's a very good idea, but it's not like that. And the other thing is the TPLF really a party, a government, or a government representing 6% of the Tigrayan population, and all Tigrayans in Ethiopia now, they are faring better. I was there 2 weeks ago. Like all times, most of the migrant beggars in the street are from Tigray. So unless those people are inherently, or their DNA is to beg, they shouldn't be begging, but they are there. So to me, that is a recipe for disaster. It's just like condemning the entire population of Tigray for the ill of the country. I don't think it's going to take us anywhere, because a lot of other ethnic elites are involved in the government. So whatever ill there is an inter-ethnic conflict of elites. That's why land, or the problem of land, has to be settled, which brings me the Oromo uprising of the current issue. It is a tinderbox that I say it because the land issue has not, the identity of land is not settled. One way or the other, it has to be settled. That's what I say.
Terence, you care to comment on either of those questions?
Yeah, I largely agree on the interesting developmental state model, and I don't think we fully understand it. The larger question I would make on that, though, is that rapid development inherently causes conflict. As people, there's transition, there's fluidity, some people are going up, some people are going down. And can the political side of the equation manage that as a country gets more urbanized and people are moving around more, and the question of who controls land, to take your point, becomes commodified. And that leads me to my political question. I was very wise in that threat assessment piece to say long-term without giving any amount of time attached to it, because it could be, you're saying that perhaps the country is on the brink of disaster. What I would argue is that the EPRDF as a ruling party still has considerable resources. It's still a very large party, has a very a disciplined army that it controls. It has access to capital and jobs, and that its challengers, because of this means of conflict management, its challengers are scattered or divided, can erupt in kind of spontaneous acts of violence, but in general, those are containable. And I think that there's still every reason to think that the EPRDF will be able to sustain itself in the short term. And I'm not going to give you times on the short term. And in fact, how I would tell part of the Oromo uprising story would be a crisis within the OPDO. The part of the EPRDF, the ruling party, that is the Oromo part, is being shattered by this fight over land and over voice and over over political power. So it can still be an intra-EPRDF. Perhaps it's the elite point that you're trying to make, but that it's a crisis within the ruling party rather than a crisis that's going to overthrow the ruling party.
It's the woman in the 5th row here, and then behind her, the gentleman in the 7th row. Actually, we'll do 5th, 6th, 7th. We'll take 3 at a time because you're all sort of 3 in a line there.
Thank you. Truvats from American University. I want to say a quote from Rommel in 1990. Power kills, absolute power. That what is said about economic aid from United States.
Just a quick ground rule. I will allow a comment, but please keep it brief.
Okay. Sorry? Oh, okay. I think Professor Abiy said about feeling safe going home, and I feel safe too when I go home because I live in the United States, even though I'm an Ethiopian. But will Ethiopia be safe to its own people? In the last 5 months, 400 will be dead. And can I confidently say it is safe? Second, a lot of people undermine the Oromo is center with OPDO. But if you look at where the Oromo are settled, the border with Somalia and the Al-Shabaab. So how do you explain the regional stability if this movement or the Oromo movement spill over towards that? And can we say safely that this will not be a prolonged conflict if it is intertwined with Al-Shabaab, which is most likely possible in my view? Second, you undermined the 10 million people who are affected by drought. I lived through the first drought. I was a senior in high school, and I helped through that process. And it is a scare for every Ethiopian that this might be really a disaster, and 1 out of 10 Ethiopians are lacking food, and numbers are big, but it is a nightmare for all of us, and how you would like.
Thank you. You could pass the microphone to the gentleman right behind you, and then he can do so to the gentleman behind him.
Sorry, it's difficult for me to stand up. Tom Olson. Nobody mentioned anything about the dam. And is that because nobody thinks that this is a real problem between Ethiopia and Egypt? Or it's just something that isn't very current, so who cares? The other side of it is that possibly going to alleviate the drought situation when the dam backs up big quantities of water? And the third thing is a religious conflict doesn't seem to exist in Ethiopia, even though there's such a very large Muslim population. Is this seething under the surface, or is it, anyway, just comment about that.
Thank you. And with, since you're both taking good notes, we'll take one more question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Brahan Senyi. I'm an attorney. I'm from Ethiopia. My question is on the Ethiopian identity component, on the Oromo protest, and on the land grab issues. So I'll raise 3 questions.
Try to keep it to 1 or 2 if you can, because
I can do that.
I've got 3 people times 3 questions. It's getting to be a lot.
Okay, I can do that. The first question on the Ethiopian identity is how raises the fundamental question of how the country is starting to become a nation state. It started on the assimilation project of assimilating all other ethnic groups into one language, one religion, and one culture. That project, which started almost 100 years ago, failed, and the ethnic identity politics emerged. And since 1991, the government at regional level attempted to address that issue while the assimilation project continued at the federal level. And the Oromo people are protesting that because the Oromos, because of the language factor, are entirely excluded from the government. Amharic is the federal working language, and the Oromo, the single largest language speaker in the country, is entirely excluded from the economy, the politics, and the urban area. If you go to Addis Ababa, you barely find an Oromo in that city. So the assimilation project is undermining the Ethiopian identity, and it is not even being spoken. That is part of the strategic failures. And the second issue is the land grab issue. It also interconnected with the development part, because what we see is actually a development by dispossession. It is, you could call it a transfer of land and wealth from the poor, both urban and rural poor, to the urban elites and politically connected newly emerging capitalists. And that is undermining the stability. So I want Professor Lenz to comment on the assimilation project and on this model of wealth and land transfer from the poor to the rich under the cover of development. And so, thank you.
Thank you. Terence, why don't we start with you then?
Wow. Let me say a word or two about the dam, and then I'll see if I can handle the identity question as well. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is moving ahead. The Ethiopians have made this a commitment that is of their highest priority. Egypt doesn't like it, but I'm not sure what Egypt's alternatives are. Ethiopia is forging ahead. Egypt is going to have to come to going to face a difficult moment when it has less control over the Nile than it wishes and that it historically has. The drought is much more towards the east, and so in the short term, it's not going to be that you can irrigate out of the dam to take care of the area of drought. Ethiopia is a big, big place. Traditionally in Ethiopia, you also asked about religion. Traditionally, village-level Christianity and village-level Islam were very intertwined. They shared sites that they would have pilgrimages to. It was very much a kind of a folk, or at least a village-level kind of religion. That, I think, is still the overriding story, but it's becoming much, much more polarized as more forms of Islam from abroad are becoming increasingly popular. Forms of Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity, are becoming much more salient, and the religious tensions are probably rising, and that's a real worry. It comes to the Shabab issue as well, is that if you began to see more of that, then indeed I'd be extremely worried, or would increasingly worried about the medium-term stability of Ethiopia. The language issue is without a doubt important to the Oromo. I remember going back to the early 90s when it was to be able to write not in the Fideles but in the Latin alphabet was a huge issue of Oromo identity, something that the EPRDF seized upon actually to give it some local legitimacy on the ground. To me, one of the things that this government has done from 1991 is it really did transform what had been a hierarchy of ethnicities that going back 100 years with the Oromo and even more so the people in Gambela and the Afar and people down in Gamagofa, decidedly on the lower rungs, to a system where it's much more varied. And so that you have political life. In a place like, let me use Hawassa as the example in the SNNPR, the southern region. It's a vibrant city with government, civil servants going about their business, and a big central Ethiopian bank, and people are investing, and there's a lot of action going on in the South, which was never true until 1991. It was very much, the hinterland that was servicing the North. And I think that's a remarkable accomplishment. Now, is it sufficient? Or, the good news is that you freed up these energies. The bad news is these energies now are trying to find a place to move next, and so forth. But I do think that the question of what is Ethiopia as an identity has been transformed in the last 25 years. Now, I don't think it's either or. Some of my Oromo friends keep trying to push that I am Oromo, I'm not Ethiopian, which they're allowed to, identify as they wish, but much more hybrid. Sort of what you were saying, it depends on the context, but there's lots of different ways of being Ethiopian, lots of different ways of being Oromo that they blend and they bleed, maybe a bad image, but they overlap each other and perhaps undermine each other at other times. And so it's much more a complex mix, in my experience, with what I see with my Ferengi eyes, between the meaning, what the Oromo, what it means to be an Oromo. And I do think there's a Oromo in Addis Ababa, for example, who are working in business, they're at the university, they're working for big NGOs. There's a lot of Oromo in Ethiopia, everywhere. The ambassador here, for example, is an Oromo. Conclude on that. Abby.
Well, coming to safety, yes, I think Ethiopia is safe. I mean, there is not, this should not be like in absolute term, because if I say, is Washington safe? I say, depends when. If you go to Anacostia or Southeast, it's not safe. But can we say Washington is safe? We can say, yeah, Washington is safe, but implicitly we also know, not to avoid certain areas. So if you go to Ethiopia, yes, Ethiopia is safe in general, but are there problems? Yes, there are problems. I'm not denying the fact that there aren't any problems in Ethiopia. There are problems, but when I see all the alternatives that are presented or has been presented, I don't see any fundamental, positively thought out change. It's just like a matter of criticizing the status quo. Okay, we can criticize it to death, but we have to provide an alternative. The other is the drought issue. Yes, the drought issue is very serious. It might develop into famine. But the government is doing something. It hasn't been, like you said, it hasn't been transpired into a famine. It has been drought, there was an effect. Is there a problem with that? Yes, there is a problem. What would be the problem? Again, it has to come with access or the identity of land. Finally, coming to the others, about identities, the Oromo identity, whatever. I can say, I don't see Ethiopia without Oromos. The problem with the Oromo nationalism is the fact that they, or it, the identity form, it exonerates itself like, I am not Ethiopian. I don't see, Ethiopia is made by Oromos. Actually, the so-called colonization of Oromos is only happened by European guns over the course of the 100 years. But you go to any part of Ethiopia, from south to north, everywhere the Oromo people were a key player. And to me, I think the solution, not only to the Oromos, to all Ethiopians, is to say there is no Ethiopia without Oromo. Not the land, I'm talking the mentality, the culture, the whatever, even our names, our words that you are using. It's very much ingrained with Oromia. But it's a modern idea of assimilation. Every country is assimilated by force, regardless, the US, Britain, whatever you call it. Either you have to undo what has been done, or start all over again. I don't think that is logically possible, or continue from where we are, okay? The other thing is identities. Identities are not just like a matter of choice. Every identity, especially the three ones, racial, national, and ethnic, they are inherently, fundamentally anchored in some deep structures. Ethnicity is based on householding, which is an income pooling institution. You have to have a household in order to have an ethnicity. That's why most of us, hyphenated Americans, where do you learn the genesis of your parenthood? In the kitchen table. You know, your grandfather came from Ireland and blah, blah. That's why you learn your Irish American thing. It's not taught in school. National identity is creation of the state. And racial identity is the creation of the global division of labor. So when you put an Ethiopian in the mix, he is all of them, or she is all of them. You understand what I'm saying? So the ethnic identity is important, not because it is the best or the most noble one. It is important because the national identity has been undermined with the crisis of the interstate system, which goes with the crisis of the state system, of the state itself. So we have to go to our income pooling institution, to the household. Most of you send money to your original country if you are foreigners. Even if you are Americans, you have a family form, whether it's nuclear, extended, whatever. That's an important identity, and that is what ethnicity is all about.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 10 minutes to go. I'm going to impose lightning round rules on everyone, which means you get one question per person, and it's got to be quick. The comments have been excellent. I'm not in any way criticizing the comments, but from this point on, it's just going to be short questions, please, and short answers. And we'll see if we can get through 2 last rounds. So I'm going to sort of do one from the front and one more towards the back. So we'll do these 3 here, and then answers, and then we'll go back for one final round, if the first 3 and our panelists can keep things brief.
We have to behave and be short.
Okay.
Good morning. I'm Peter Gabra from ASB International Business and Market Development. My question would be for Professor Abiy on the land ownership issue. What do you think? I mean, land to the tiller was the base for the revolution, and the Derg. The land tenure system is now public ownership, but do you believe that land ownership has not been properly properly defined or properly solved?
Thank you.
What do you think would be the solution, private or public? What do you think would be the solution?
Thank you. And then right behind here.
So I'm Nancy Hayden, and I just finished doctorate. I finished at University of Maryland, and I was studying security in East Africa, and I spent quite some time in Ethiopia. And they have wonderful growth, but they're still one of the lowest GDPs in Africa. They have some of the highest, the highest, one of the highest rural population, even though there's urbanization going on. It's subsistence agriculture, and there is no technology. I was in the museum, and they showed the hand-hewn, I forget what you call them, as something of the past, but that's not the past. That is the way the subsistence farmers farm. And so what do you see the economic development being among these huge rural populations that does not involve foreign direct investment from China or leasing the land to Pakistan, but it actually takes care of the masses in the rural areas as you look forward the next 20 years?
Thank you. And then finally here.
My question is for Professor Abiy, and it is on regional security issue in Ethiopia. Given that Ethiopia has absorbed a Somali population, what is Ethiopia's stance specifically on the Somali piracy issue and the surrounding states? How are they addressing that issue? Thank you.
The second one?
No, that's it. Just
piracy?
How are the regional states addressing the piracy issue in tandem with Ethiopia?
Terrence, why don't you take whichever of the 3 you wish, and then Abiy can finish.
Maybe I'll just comment on the final piece of the Somali piracy, because for a variety of reasons having to do with the ship owners themselves, as well as changes on the ground in Somalia, it's become a more managed problem. It was my managed question. Ethiopia is a landlocked country, so it's not worried directly, doesn't have its navy out there chasing pirates the way that some other countries do, but it certainly is looking for stability and trade and the transformation of Somalia into a country that can control its hinterland.
Abi.
Yeah, the solution to land, with all honesty, I don't have a pretty, like an easy answer to it. But one thing I know, it shouldn't be an issue between privatization or public ownership, because I really understand the logic why land should not be privatized, because obviously the haves would come and dispossess the have-nots. But at the same time, I can see the government leasing lands mostly to foreign investors, large-scale ones. There is a contradiction right there. To me, the most important factor that is missing are the people, because the government of Ethiopia, the intellectuals abroad and inside, we are extremely modernist in the sense we believe in development. Development of what? Of the country. What is the country? Well, you can talk about GNP, statistics, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, we can measure it by the living standard and dignity of the individual. That is missing in our picture because we all speak English. I mean, we are elitists in a sense that we have to include the critical factors that the people can play. And that has to be the primary course of how subsistence farmer can engage in commodity production. For example, my wife is from Switzerland. They have a little plots of wine, like vineyards. It's owned by individuals, but they sell it to a cooperative together, and that cooperative turn it into a wine. And so why wouldn't the Ethiopian farmers allow to grow commodities like orange fruits and so on and so forth? Because the infrastructure is there. Because the incentive is not there, because deep inside we think that they are not capable of doing that. Believe me, they are. Actually, they know more about the land than we do. The Somali piracy issue. Well, piracy to me is a product of excessive fishing by big fishing companies. Those people that you see in the coast of Somalia who are engaged in piracy, they are all fishermen. Then you have these big Japanese, Chinese, European trawlers. They come and took all the fish, and they start, instead of fishing fish, they start fishing ships. And they became a very important factor because they disrupt the global maritime network. It goes back to the same thing. We need states. Somalia does not have a state, and look at what's happening. The state is an evil, it's not an evil institution that is proclaimed by liberalism, you know. We don't like the states, but why? To me, the state is a necessary, not evil, it's a necessary thing that can be used to the best, to the good.
Okay, we're going to do two last questions in the back, and we'll do all the way back in the far right, and then over here, Doug.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. My name is Damaksa Oli. My question is about the contradictory policy of foreign policy of the United States. As we know, I am a natural citizen, but I was a political asylee. And I believe that the United States, with all its imperfections, is a multicultural and democratic country. But there is a contradiction with regard to its foreign policy, because the foreign policy is based on security interests. Now, the TPLF or Ethiopian regime is considered as a partner in the war against so-called terrorism. But if we research the cause of instability and mentality of those kinds of extremism and terrorism, some of the social causes are, inherent in unstable countries.
Got to hurry up, please.
Yeah, okay.
We got 1 minute to go.
Ethiopia being a dictatorial country, a regime which is killing innocent protesters, school children, even pregnant women. why shouldn't the U.S. learn from its previous foreign policy debacles, for example, in the Latin American, so that they reconcile that, make a partner from a more genuine democratic country, not a dictatorial regime that is a cause of instability.
Go on over here, please.
Hi, Doug Brooks, International Stability Operations Association. What is the popular perception of the Ethiopian army inside Ethiopia, its ethnic leadership, and what is the role it does in terms of internal security?
Abby, do you want to start this round, and then Terence can finish?
The contradictory U.S. policy. Why are they contradictory? Unless we believe that the U.S. is just like some saintly, non-political entity that is there to preserve the good of the global community. If you believe that, then we should go to church. Because the U.S. is a political entity. What it says and what it does, like any other political entity, is not the same and should not be the same. I mean, we should know that. Of course, even to ask the question, it's a political question. Because we want to say the U.S., okay, shut up or put up, as long as it disagrees with us. But if it does with the policies that we agree, we might say, okay, that's fine. So there is no genuine democracy or pure Ethiopian, like they say here. All those extremist absolute terms are really not serving anything. What was the second question?
Perceptions of the military?
Oh, yeah, the military. Well, in Ethiopia, the military, everybody, okay, the nationalism factor is there. I say that because during the Ethio-Eritrean war, everybody across the country, they were rose up in that effort. With the military composition, I don't know, really. But I know, like, the higher brass are all former TPLF fighters, predominantly from a single ethnic group. But how is the military effective? It's extremely effective. Because they do the military work. We don't see parades and so on like the military government of the previous regime, but they are effective, even attested by the US military.
Terence, last word.
My last word. The way I would frame the U.S. foreign policy question is a short-term, long-term distinction, that in the short term, if there's a perception that this serves U.S. national interest, having a security alliance, a security partnership with Ethiopia. The more difficult question to judge, well, in the long term, is this going to cause instability in the Horn of Africa and undermine or set back U.S. interests? And the United States as a political system has a very difficult time thinking long term, thinking about where we're going to be in 10, 15, 20 years, not just on relations with Ethiopia, but on almost any other topic. And so I think that's one of the explanations for the contradiction, as you put it, in U.S. Foreign policy. I don't have much to add on the military piece, so maybe I'll just close it there.
Well, listen, thanks to all of you, because this was a rich conversation, an unusual one for Brookings to be able to spend so much time on Ethiopia.